I'm just going to say a little bit about the show, which came together through this pandemic that we've all been in. And Ryan and Amanda approached me about the show, and I was really excited to be able to be part of it. And as were the people at Contact, because they did choose this show as one of their selected jury called shows, which used to be called a feature exhibition. And so this work in concept was gonna, show two artists who happened to who knew each other from school and realized they were working on something that had some overlap. And then how would this work together? And as you can see here, and as you'll see, the work is, it complements each other so well. I love how contemporary the work is. We think of still life as being a genre from art history with deep, deep roots from the very, I think about Roman still lives, things that allow us to see how people lived at different points of time. This work is very contemporary in that it's reflecting moments of this pandemic and how it's affected things, and the idea of time has really altered, and also the idea of wealth and material possessions. I think that's been something else that's changed in people's minds. I'm not going to speak too much more to that now. I'm going to let Amanda start her slideshow, and I'll see you all at the end of Ryan's talk. Enjoy.
Thank you so much for that intro. That was lovely. So the work my name's Amanda Arcuri. I'm a photographic artist here based in Toronto. The work that you primarily see in Fire and Dust is from my series titled A Shot in the Dark. The series explores notions of death and redemption by photographing discarded floral arrangements that might have been appropriated for human use. It explores failed hopes and rituals of letting go. The title, A Shot in the Dark, references this persistence and perseverance, but also acknowledging that there might be little hope or one last hope. The title also references a little bit cheekily about how the images are shot as they are actually shot in the dark. This is a series for me that I actually started pre-pandemic, but some of it really speaks to pandemic time. Shot during a time when I spent a lot of time at home. So I think that there is something to be said there. And I'll talk further more about some work that was made specifically during COVID as we go forward. So the work dates back to 2019 at the earliest, and it's still going. I started by thinking about the gesture of giving flowers and that emotional sentiment and that gesture, and how as those flowers might sit in your home, that sentiment has passed, time is passing, and maybe that gesture is kind of disappearing. So I began to photograph them and light them on fire in an attempt to revive those sentiments while also preserving the gesture. As I mentioned, the pieces are shot in the dark. So they're actually shot during a long exposure, and I'm photographing them with the use from a stained glass piece. So light is shone through a stained glass window, actually almost in the round. So I'm almost photographing around the piece with colored light. And the stained glass is meant to reference spirituality, sentiment of transcendence. It is chosen on purpose. It's also chosen to give this idea of artificial light on top of that kind of natural substance. That artificial colored light on foliage is something that I've been interested for a while. In my larger practice, I'm always attracted to seemingly unpicturesque foliage as I stemmed from a landscape background. And then intervening with human elements or, again, artificial light is a particular interest to me. I enjoy photographing the subject matter in the way I do to attempt to re-examine our relationship with it, and also to present it in a way that seems almost outerworldly or just very different and strange. Again, I photograph long exposures. I'm actually photographing on film. So everything in this series is photographed large format film. And with that comes some element of surprise. So I typically only get about 2 negatives per shot. And as I'm actually burning my my subject matter, but sometimes you get these lovely kind of happenstances, and that's actually what you see here with these little red lines. So those are kind of some after effects from the lighting technique. The stained glass is what brings this kind of colored element to the stems and the foliage. And the process, like I said, always kind of brings a little element of surprise. And so here's an example of one of the negatives. So they are large. I photograph using the large format camera because it references a photographic history that I want to bring to my practice. Especially in my landscape practice, I was particularly interested in asking this question of what constitutes an altered landscape. So you can think about the type of work I was trying to reference, some large format male photographers shooting large format film, and I wanted to play with what that notion is, and now I've brought it into the indoor foliage that we tend to look at home. Again, the pieces are then ignited by flame as well, and this gesture is extremely symbolic. It is symbolic of, again, the power that fire has to both destroy but also to bring new life. And that's what I'm hoping to weave into these kind of otherwise mundane scenes. Again, the flame acts like a metaphor. It's a source of destruction and a source of life. Not every piece in the series has that flame, but you might see references to it. So again, here you might see those little charred edges of this image. You can see the aftermath of it, which I really appreciate. And there's a playing with time. So we might think that these images are shot in an instant, but again, they're actually about 5 minutes, I would say, in time. And during that time, again, I'm lighting and the flame is also added. So we end up kind of having a little bit of this movement, which I'll show you in detail. This is the largest piece in the show. It is 50 by 40, and it's a number 11 from the series A Shot in the Dark, and it is framed with a pink plexi frame. It almost glows in real life, which is lovely as light actually reflects through it, which I think is interesting to reference my process of how interested I am in light, but also to pick up on the color in the image too. So we have that highlighted pink from the stained glass, and then we have the pink plexi. So here's a detail. And this image really nicely shows that time. So again, from far, it almost seems like it's an instant, but as you get deeper and you kind of see the details within it, you'll notice that there's a little bit of movement. So you can see that really nicely right here. You might see the shadow of what was foliage that was attached to this display, but then actually fell during that exposure, during that time. I have a little video I'll share with you of some of it's a bit of a process video, but it's also a bit of a piece on its own. So it's quite meditative, but also seductive. The flame becomes a character in the scene that is played out. Here is an image that is from what I titled the Remix series. And this is a smaller series that has come out of A Shot in the Dark. And this was specifically made during COVID. At the beginning of COVID, I wasn't actually able to process negatives. So it forced me to look back at some negatives I already had. And again, like I said, I typically only get 2 shots per subject matter, but there is movement. So as you add flame to your subject matter, things move as the flame might distort or again, melt what you're photographing. So I overlaid both negatives of the same subject matter, and that's what you see here. And by doing that, you end up with this doubling. So you kind of see wherever maybe in this case, the flower has moved during that exposure. And that's a really nice one that highlights that. In addition of having this marbled light from the stained glass in different colors, because no 2 negatives really are the same, by interacting those 2 marbled light colors, we end up with something that almost becomes iridescent. So again, as they meld the 2 images together, you get these really almost chemical stain-like colors in some of the areas. And I think that references the time to me quite nicely, while also adding, again, that outer worldly effect that I think is so important to my work when looking at this subject matter. I tend to live with my subject matter, as you might see behind me. Most of the time, the flowers I'm photographing are flowers or arrangements that have been given to me for certain occasions in my life, or I've collected from sentimental moments in my life. Sometimes they are just gifts, knowing that I'm shooting the project. But what becomes important is I attach a personal connection to them, as I can watch them fold and bend as they do start to neglect over time, as they start to die over time and from neglect. And they actually start to collect dust sometimes, and I get the opportunity to see when I want to photograph them. The magic really happens in camera. The foliage is pretty desaturated from the start, and they're photographed on a white background. And I'm really composing the image in my head while making and basically lighting it. And then in the end, finally lighting it on fire. It is a symbolic act, and an act for me as well, as the series means to, persevere, keep trying, but also creating rituals to move forward and let go. So that's wrapped in there as well. These are the smallest size in the show. These are 12 by 15 and framed on white with a white frame to be almost 16 by 20. And we really wanted to put two contrasting things together. So as you can see, there's the vibrant, a shot in the dark beside Ryan's work, which he'll speak to momentarily. And we really wanted to have similar themes, but presented very differently. And the show works, and my favorite thing about the show is that it forces you to look from afar because you want to see it as a whole, and really the color kind of jumps out at you while the monochromatic really recedes. But it also forces you to get really close as well. And I think that experience is really lovely. So I'm really pleased with having the two works presented together. And again, we shot these works separately, but the idea was put forward to share them together, and it was really exciting. So I'm going to turn it over to Ryan, who will talk about his work. This has been lovely. And again, if you have questions, there will be a Q&A at the end.
Thank you so much, Amanda. That was fantastic. I'm just going to share my screen. Oops. And everybody gets a preview of my show. So I wanted to start with how the series Collecting Dust began. So about 3 years ago at an opening of mine, one of my mom's friends actually said to me in passing that the purpose of art is to collect dust. And I took this in a way that wasn't like shady, but was more about like being prophetic and kind of like a beautiful saying. And I took note of it like I do many kind of ideas. And over COVID, I came back to it. I started thinking a lot about the works of art that I go to see. I am somebody who makes pilgrimages every year to go see art. It's a big part of my life. And it's something that I really missed throughout COVID. So I started kind of picturing these works collecting dust, and like many people, I was having kind of post-apocalyptic thoughts at the same time. And so imagining this kind of world of dust and what happens to the artifacts that are most important to us after we're gone. I started taking famous artworks and applying this layer of dust. And obviously the David is not one that has ever had that happen to it. I think it's probably been seen its entire life. But I was also interested in pieces like the Laocoon, who were actually rediscovered in the Renaissance and were probably discovered collecting dust underground. So this brings me to the work that's in the show. All the works in the show are still lives, all shot in the studio. And I've really been interested for a long time in Vanitas painting, which was Dutch painting done in the 15th and 16th century that was highly symbolic. It was about basically two things. It was about the display of wealth, but also about death and memento mori and the kind of thinking about the afterlife. So it was really rich with symbols, thinking about how do we, A, show what we've got, and how to kind of show that we're living a good life, and thinking about the afterlife. So this piece, Feast, shows a lot of the symbols that are really characteristic of Vanitas. But I'm going to take you through a number of the symbols of Vanitas that are really prevalent in my work. So the first one is the skull. So the symbol of the skull is fairly straightforward. It's about the fragility of life. It's something that we see in so many paintings and that we're really drawn to, really from the beginning of history to like Damien Hirst, For the Love of God, a skull like covered in diamonds. So it's something that really ties art history together. Then decaying flowers, which of course Amanda talked a lot about, tend to represent the decay of the body, but also their display of wealth. They have these big, beautiful displays. And of course, tulips by the Dutch were collected and traded, and were kind of like the first futures market. But each flower has its own meaning. So the rose represents love, sensuality, vanity, as we can imagine. The poppy was tied to the opiate trade and represented sin. And then tulips were representative of foolishness. And this piece is actually based on a Mapplethorpe photograph that really influenced me. And if the next slide would go, that would be awesome. Oh, skip 2. There we go. Okay, the candle or the lamp is typically representative of the soul, and the blowing out of it represents the fragility of life. So that's often seen as a candle just as after it's blown out. And then the butterfly is something that I reference throughout the series. It's about birth, rebirth, and renewal as the caterpillar becomes the butterfly. It's the only piece throughout the series that isn't covered in dust. It's kind of, for me, about nature taking back the world. So you'll see it throughout. And then books are about humans, our curiosity, our knowledge, and really a representation of humanity. So now with all that preamble, as you see this larger piece extinguished, you can really read it from left to right and see so many symbols, and even symbols that you may not know that I didn't talk about, you can kind of assume what they might mean at that time. So of course we see the candle and the smoke, which I just talked about, but the grapes, which represent fertility because there's so many of them and so many seeds, the lobster representing opulence and, just being something that is sought after. And pomegranates, again, representing fertility. Here you see the butterfly and many different flowers, the rose here and the skull. And you're able to create really, sorry, I actually just wanted to touch on one other thing with that photo, which is that, of course, these pieces are a construction, and they actually have ability to tell multiple truths. So when you're looking at this piece, it feels like it's been sitting there for hundreds of years, which is kind of what's supposed to be that first reading that has this like stasis. But then the smoke alludes to the fact that this was just blown out. And so it's kind of about photography's ability to tell lies as well as truths, and multiple lies and truths at the same time. And so with all those kind of readings, we're able to read a real story into still lives. So here we see the pomegranates at the bottom, which again are representative of fertility and rebirth with all their many seeds. And then the butterfly, also representative of rebirth, traveling up the books that are representative of knowledge and getting to more and more rebirth. So it's a piece about hope. So I'm going to show you a little bit behind the scenes of how this all actually happens. The camera footage is a little shaky, but basically what I do, it's all shot in the studio, and I start with a thick layer of dust, typically steel dust. And then on top of that, I'm working with chalk and ash and different kind of layers of dust to be able to really painterly fill in all the highlights and the shadows. And then I can even go through with different colors to draw in and paint in different highlights that are only seen in black and white photos. So it's interesting that you have these kind of intensely monochromatic pieces that are actually quite colorful. Oh, I don't want to show you that again. And so the pieces are editioned in 3 sizes. They all serve a different purpose. So for me, these pieces have this historic feeling to it, especially from a distance. And I really wanted to bring that through in the presentation itself. So these are 8x10s. They're framed to 11x14 with a 8-ply mat, which is really typical in museum collections of historic photographs. So typically they are these kind of handmade pieces, and you get to go in and really see these details from, as close up as you can. So I was interested in seeing how I can take these photographs that once you get close are clearly contemporary, but from a distance feel very historical. And then my medium size is a 20x24. And with that one, you get to kind of get into the piece. You get into all the nooks and crevices and get to see the detail in the dust. And you get to kind of read all these symbols and get into every little kind of intention in the photograph. And then the last piece, which is the largest at the show, is a 40x50 of extinguished. And with that one, you get to see literally like grains of dust. I photographed this with a very large format digital camera. And I really wanted you not to get stuck in the photography of it. So there's no grain. You really just get right into the object itself. And much like with the 8x10s, with this piece, you can really get up close and see more and more and more. So that was really important to me. Then I'm just gonna touch on the kind of most recent piece in the series, in which I'm kind of deconstructing some of those symbols and taking a bit more of a pastiche to take on it and bringing a lot of different things together. So in the center, you see Canova's piece, the 3 Graces, which is meant to be about youth and kind of jubilance, but when you cover it in dust, it has a very different take. And they're surrounded by different symbols here of beauty and contemporary objects like the iPhone here beside my grandmother's teacup, which is now broken and falling over, and symbols of fertility here, but also a little squirrel poking out at you, kind of just giving it a bit of fun so that you're not, when you do historical work like this, sometimes it can become very serious very quickly. And I like the idea of kind of pulling that back and pulling the lens back and saying, this is a construction, and that we get to kind of enjoy that. So I'm going to turn it back to Burke for some Q&A, and thank you all for joining us. Burke, you're muted.
Thank you again, Ryan, for helping me unmute myself, and also for both of the slide presentations you each gave. It's every time I learn something new about the work, I love it. And I think that speaks to the quality and the depth of your work and how intense it is. Yeah, we'll have a little Q&A now. If you would like, you can put a question into the chat. You can raise your hand. And I think we've already got something happening here. Did we see something there?
Yes, there's a question in the chat.
Yes. Who's that for?
I think just read it out loud.
That's Lobster, so I think it's Ryan.
Yeah, so shells and lobsters at that time were representative of wealth. Then I know in like the 20s or the 19th century, they became like a garbage fish that was like given to literally everybody. But shells and kind of shellfish were kind of a symbol of opulence at that time.
Okay. I was curious about that.
And again, and I guess it is again.
It's interesting how it speaks to the value of things and how the value of things change over time. And we've certainly seen through COVID, people's sense of what is valuable has changed.
Yes, certainly.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, I value a haircut a lot more than I used to.
absolutely.
Any other questions that someone wants to raise a hand for or put into the chat there? I've got a couple questions, but yes, or
Yeah, so I would just love to hear you talk a bit more about how you decided to collaborate. Like the works just seem like such a natural fit together, but you obviously developed them individually. But just curious about the process of coming together on this.
Yeah. Ryan, do you want to do the first bit or do you want me to speak to it first?
Sure, yeah, I can speak to it. Amanda's been working on this work for a number of years now. And I've seen it, loved it, and enjoyed it. And then I started working on this over COVID. So all of my work is kind of 2021 and 2020. And I just saw these connections. And I loved how we were talking about similar things, conceptually quite similar, but aesthetically just as wildly different as it could be. This kind of like intensely monochromatic with the sublime color. And I just kind of visualized like, what would this look like together? And I wanted to see it myself. So yeah, maybe Amanda, you can take it over.
Yeah, so Ryan approached me. We had the idea to do it as a contact exhibition, which, you know, was a bit of a gamble at the time, but it worked out. And I agree. I was also really excited to see what would happen in the gallery by putting these really dark, mostly black images in contrast with mine. And they really complement each other, even more than I expected, which is exciting.
Does that answer your question, or?
Yeah, no, I love how they look together and just some of the little parallels, like even looking at the two big pieces, like noticing like the rose in Amanda's piece and then in Ryan's, like it just seems like you could have developed them kind of alongside each other, but I know that wasn't the process. So yeah, just really cool.
Thanks, Or.
So I had a question for Ryan. You talked about the objects. I'm wondering, when you're doing these pieces, thinking more specifically like the objects, like the three graces, how does your relationship to these objects or the meaning of that object change throughout the process of you photographing them?
Sure. So I am using primarily works of art that I'm drawn to. I think that sometimes people see these pieces and they think that it's about like kind of a criticism of Western art and history. I think for me, it's actually more paying homage to them. But yeah, you get to see, I mean, obviously these are not the real works that I'm working with. I'm working with miniatures. And it's really interesting to kind of get to handle these pieces, even as miniatures. They are often made of marble or bronze. And you get to kind of have this different relationship of holding them and moving them. I actually used to be, after college, an art mover. And there's a really interesting thing to holding artworks that you wouldn't normally. So even when they're not real, they still have something to them. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and does that something, does it grow? Are you more?
It transforms. You know, I don't always know exactly how something's going to look like transformed. Is it going to lose detail? Are you going to be able to see through it? Are you going to get lost? I think that it becomes its own thing. It becomes its own character to me. And I then get to discover that through light and through the camera. So a lot of my work is in the studio, really playing with and manipulating light. Typically, all these works are done with one light and then maybe a few other modifiers, which brings it back to that kind of historical work that was typically done with one window. I get to really kind of, especially because they're so small, get to really play and see how these works look like from different angles and different kind of views.
Yeah, and the scale also changes. So on a similar question for Amanda, I was thinking, you know, your works, you're photographing them is also a destruction of the piece. So and you've kept them. So I figure they mean something to you. I know they mean something to you because you've told us that, you know, each bouquet has got a different meaning to you. Are there some bouquets that like were really hard to let go of? Because that's also, you talked about the path moving forward through destruction. So like, are there ones that are in your home right now that are never going to be burned, or are there ones that should have been burned long ago that you got to get around to?
There's all the options. Yeah, some of them are sentimental, and even after the photograph, even after the burning, I have attempted to keep some of them, which have resulted in some interesting things. I kept one of them on my balcony after photographing it, and then it attracted to pigeons. So there'll be a later documentary about that. And in some cases, I can't keep them because they are just charred and I have to let them go. And in a way, that's part of the process. It's like, it's to a degree, it is using the photographic process and even the performativity of photography to help me move forward in things in my life. And then in some situations where maybe the floral arrangements didn't have meaning in the first place, something happens when you photograph it as well. All of a sudden, it starts to mean something more because it's in this photograph. So some pieces I own that I still have a little bit of burn on them. I think there's one behind me that has that. And then I have quite a few pieces that do need to be burned, and should have burned a long time ago, like you said. But I'm at this point, you know, you kind of wait for the right moment and it'll come.
Okay. And if you burn them into ash, I think Ryan might have some use for it.
Absolutely. I actually have a question on that train. So having seen that video, which I haven't seen exactly how the work was made before, I was struck by how subtle the flame is. And I kind of imagined the creation of these works being these balls of like fire and smoke alarms going off. But it seems like perhaps that's not the case. And when you mentioned that it's a 5-minute exposure, so is it this really subtle flame that's taking, you know, a great deal of time to kind of build up?
So a part of what attracts me to photographing film and photographing with fire is there's an element of unknown. So again, that performativity and that aspect of photography is really interesting to me. Lots of flowers will burn a little bit differently. I mean, you start to learn what will burn well and fast and some and what won't. But there's sometimes it's a slow flame and sometimes it's actually hard to get the piece ignited. And I actually love the little small ambers and letting those go. And because I love them so much, I try to have more of those. But then sometimes, yes, sometimes there is a big flame. Sometimes it's purposely a big flame, so there's purposely a small flame. So I really do like to play with both options. Does that help? Does that answer?
Yeah.
Thanks for your question, Brian.
Any other questions from anyone? This work also reminds me of that saying that all art was once contemporary. You know, so this work is, as we're talking about, is very contemporary to this moment now, as I think every still life once was. And that's kind of what attracts us to some of this historical work. You think, oh, look at the food they were eating back then, and look how they put it together. But also, it's, to Ryan's point, it's all artifice, right? Everything we're seeing is artifice. And I like how your work combines time and light. And I feel there's hope in it, because I think for a lot of us now, time represents hope. Like in COVID, it's like a little bit more time will pass and we'll get a little bit more freedom to be open, to return to doing things that have great meaning to us, like seeing friends and family. It's kind of like you're both working in the dark so much, but the long exposures bring out the light and we can actually see something. I think that's really cool. Not a question.
I agree. Yeah.
I like that sentence. I think that's a good sentence to wrap up with.
Yeah. So if there are no more questions here, any comments for Amanda or Ryan about the work, about the show? Yes, Bogdan. Take your mute off.
You're muted.
I was saying, I don't know if I have a question, but maybe I'll say a few things and a question might formulate itself. I'm thinking about the idea of talking about your work. I'm a painter and I'm super interested in images and photography and relationship between painting and cinema and photography. And of course, I'm very familiar with the still life tradition and the symbolism. But as I was listening to your, very insightful talks, it struck me that, and perhaps this is photography. I noticed that photography is very technically minded medium, and I have a hard time talking about my work without explaining it somehow too much. So you both talked about how you did it. There was a lot of the lights, the exposure, the arrangement. I don't like to talk about that myself. So I'm wondering, if you feel like it's important to talk about how it was made. It's really interesting, I think, for somebody who's outside of the realm of making pictures themselves. It's probably fascinating, and I think it was awesome to see how you do it. But I'm wondering if there's a way in which you, or there's something that you hope a viewer would, or is there an experience that you hope a viewer will have with your work? Like, for me, I try to make paintings that I would like to look at, and it's hard for me to explain why I like the paintings that I like. I can talk around it somehow, but
Yeah.
So I'm just, I don't know if there's a question in there. You feel free to say something if you want.
Yeah, I think I can speak to that directly. First, I'll say that for me in my practice, I do think that my process is very important to getting to the underlying meaning and reasons that I'm doing it. So I do describe it a lot. I am interested in the performative aspects of photography. So doing things specifically for that photograph, I think, is something interesting to me. And I reference that directly in my process. And an experience that comes often with my work that is exactly where I think I want to be is when people view them and they don't believe that they're photographs. People think that they're paintings. And that wraps everything up for me perfectly. How I'm referencing that still life, how I'm using the real world around me to create situations that feel almost not real. So that's where I hope my work to live.
Awesome.
Yeah, I'll speak to that a little bit too. So, I think in terms of that experience of the viewer, this work is so new to me. A lot of it was made around the new year this year. And so getting to see people see the work for the first time, really what I wanted to happen did happen at the gallery, which was that people kind of instantly got up into the work. They were, an inch away looking into every little detail and not just experiencing the totality of it, but really kind of falling into the texture and becoming curious. So I think that's the first fold of it. But I think that photography as a medium is almost inherently conceptual. And so we as photographers learn to talk about it conceptually, whereas painting can often be more seen expressively. I think that both mediums can do both. But I think that historically, the conceptual kind of narrative in photography is so strong that, and we as photographers, our creation happens in a moment, or in Amanda's case, in 5 minutes, not over the course of months or years of working on a piece. And so you conceptualize the entire piece before the piece happens. The piece actually happens by pressing the shutter, and then it's formed by light. But you're so conceptually driven that everything is kind of created before that moment. Unless if you're, there's all sorts of reasons why that's not true, if you're a documentarian or whatever the case may be. But in our case, I would say that is largely part of it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would think I also add that, generally in an artist talk situation too, I find you hear a lot of artists talk about process rather than sometimes the feeling, like you were speaking to, you're creating work that you want to see and you want to exist in the world, and it has a feeling to you, right? So I think that's inherent in the work.
Well, you both talked about that later when you talked about the dust and how the objects feel and how you have those flowers behind you because they mean something to you. That talk is the content is also there, but comes out later.
The composition is, I think, something you guys feel, right? Like, how do you decide where to put things in your pictures and how to light it and which colors to use? Is that feeling?
That's all based on feeling. I don't even use a light meter anymore. I just feel out how long my exposure should be.
Yeah. And I think it's done well because you don't see struggle in the images. This is something, I think people relate to when they listen to a great singer like Ella Fitzgerald. You're never nervous listening to her, wondering, is she going to hit that next note? You just get to sit back and relax. And I think you guys are so good technically that's background and the work just lives. And we don't feel like, is it in focus? Is it not? Stuff like that. It's like that stuff's so done and taken care of that we just get to have the feeling of the work, which I think is really special.
Yeah. And the process, just to wrap it up and to tie it into Or's comment that's in the chat. For me, the process helps create those rituals, which this work is also about too. So yes, it does reference many rituals from different cultures and walks of life. Fire is very powerful in that way. And in some ways, this gives me a reason to do that, which I think is important for me. So that's why it's tied together.
Okay, so I think I'll just wrap it up by saying, fire and dust, we can talk about it being contemporary work, but reflective of this moment, it's just kind of crazy. I think about people who are still locked out of their offices a year and a half later, and there's these still lives that have formed on their shelves and perhaps with nasty sandwiches left in drawers. Who knows what they'll be discovered in the future. And then, like seeing Amanda's work, reading the news this past week, you think about nature on fire, like, and the heat wave that parts of the world are experiencing. I love how it's so contemporary of this very moment. Thanks for everyone for making time to come and hear this talk today. The work will still be here until July 3rd, closed for Canada Day, but otherwise, if you want to see the work, you can either send a note, try to make an appointment, or come during opening hours 12 to 6 this week, not Canada Day. So Friday, Saturday.
Great. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. It's been a pleasure.
And thanks for your questions and comments. Okay, bye.
Thank you. Congrats on the show.
Thanks.